you have, at the very end, we have James McCoy. And James McCoy has been the director of the University of Iowa Press since 2011 and was previously the marketing director for the University of Iowa Press in 2006. And during that time, the press has won several awards, including the PEN American Award, the American Book Award, and numerous Shambaugh Awards. They've also been finalists for the National Book Award. Their books are regularly reviewed in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the Times Literary Supplement. Before coming to Iowa, he spent a decade with the University of Chicago Press. He holds a BA in English from Indiana University and was born and raised in Indianapolis. He has a son and a cat, but he also loves Greek. So, okay. Next up, we have Hannah Scates-Kettler. Hannah holds a BA from the University of Iowa in anthropology with minors in art history and classics. She also holds an MA from King's College London in digital humanities, where she specialized in virtual cultural heritage. Hannah is a digital humanities research and instruction librarian in the Digital Scholarship and Publishing Studio here at the University of Iowa. And in her role, she leads digital humanities projects from inception to preservation, managing the process of creation as well as providing research and developmental support. She's also very active in 3D creation and preservation and diverse representations in cultural heritage collections and digital humanities. Okay, next up we have Timothy Arnold. Timothy has a BA in history from Yale and a Master's of Science and Information Studies from the University of Texas at Austin and a Master's of Arts in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. He's the International Reference and Collections Librarian here at the University of Iowa Libraries, and he manages the collections for Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, international studies, and for classics. His areas of research are new media and emerging technologies in the Middle East, particularly he's an expert on Twitter. And he teaches and is an expert on information literacy, reference management, and social media collection development. And right now he is getting very well versed in the historiography of classics. Okay, finally, our last panelist is Cornelia Lang, who got her PhD from the University of California at Los Angeles. She's an associate professor and now the departmental associate chair in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. Her research is focused on radio and X-ray observations of galactic nuclear regions, most importantly, the center of our own Milky Way. She is working to understand the energetic processes occurring in these regions, which include star formation and magnetic phenomena. But she has 50 publications on these subjects and told me at the gym that she loves Greek. And so I pulled her into because I was like, you like Greek? You read Greek? And she was like, oh yeah, I know Greek. And so that really is part of this discovery, that you find out the background of people who love Latin, who love Greek, who just love ancient history, and you really want to know how that informs who they are. So I'm going to sit down now and we'll ask a few questions, and then we are going to throw it to you guys to ask questions, so prepare yourselves. But my co-moderator tonight is Jen Teitle. Professor Teitle has a PhD and is an assistant dean for professional development at the University of Iowa Graduate College. She holds a doctorate in language, literacy, and culture from the University of Iowa, and a fiery torch. She has a fiery torch for interdisciplinary scholarship. She builds and maintains programs that empower graduate students to understand their strengths, build professional networks, and seize opportunities. She's also a mother to 4 children, a persistent doodler, and an aspiring breaker of chains. She reads the comment section, though she knows she should not. I should also say that she supports classics and many of the programs, particularly that the graduate students have participated in, such as the 3-minute dissertation. So, great. All right. So, I'll start off here, and then we can move to a few other questions. Although I touched on it a little bit, I just wanted to know what each of you guys' relationship is with classics, how you got started with it, and kind of how it informs what you do and who you are now. So, small question. Okay.
You're looking at me?
Sure.
Well, I think my interest in classics started probably around 4th grade when I read a book called Carry On, Mr. Bowditch, which I'm thinking maybe Cornelia is familiar with. It's about Nathaniel Bowditch, who invented a new way to navigate the seas. But he was also an autodidact. He was an indentured servitude, if I'm remembering the story correctly. And the thing that really impressed me was not that he taught himself navigation and algebra and calculus and all this stuff, but he taught himself Latin and Greek. And that stuck with me in the back of my mind. But somehow I got all through Catholic school and all through my undergraduate experience being a really poor student and never really investigating these classics, even though I had this romantic notion of it in my head. And then I found myself in a bit of a crisis, so I came to classics kind of late, in my early 30s. I was working at University of Chicago Press, which is an intellectually daunting place. Everyone seems to have a PhD, even your assistant, and everyone seems to know 8 different languages. I had neither one of these qualifications, and I think I was suffering from a great deal of intellectual inferiority complex. But I also was really felt myself stagnating intellectually. You know, there's a funny thing happens when you get into a workplace, and there are 2 routes you can go. You can be very driven and you know, work very hard to succeed. But for most of the population, you end up kind of stagnating, and it's easy just to go to work every day and push the buttons and do the low-hanging fruit and perform your task and not really think about it. And I really realized that was happening to me. Even though I was living and surrounded in this atmosphere that really fostered intellectualism and the life of the mind, I wasn't taking full advantage. So I knew I had to do something, and that something came in the form of pursuing what is known at Chicago as the basic program. What is known at other places as a Great Books program. At University of Chicago and also at Columbia, and I think at St. John's in Annapolis, and a few other places, no matter what you're studying as an undergraduate, you have to go through a 4-year program of reading the basis of the Western canon as traditionally defined. And they offered this as a adult education, continuing education course too, through their Graham School. So I began with that, and really the first 2 years are very, very heavy on Plato, Aristotle, the tragedies, Lucretius, some Shakespeare. And the Shakespeare and the English stuff I had been an English major. But the Greeks, other than, you know, some very cursory experiences in high school with, you know, Homer, I really didn't have. And so it was not only enlightening to get that background and to be a part of a discussion, not just read it, but be a part of a discussion, with a demographic that basically skewed very, very much older, almost to the retirement age, of people who had a lot of life experience. And that brings a whole different perspective to something like Aeschylus or Homer. And through that, I eventually ended up, I was approached one day after class by a woman that I had a passing acquaintance with, who was older, who was from Greece. She and her husband still owned a olive orchard in Greece. And her name was Sonia, and she came to me and said, "Jim, have you ever thought about studying ancient Greek?" I said, no. You're talking to someone who flunked out of French in college. Anything that I have to do every day is just not a good thing. So she worked on me for a while and convinced me to come to a class that she was taking, and it was above my level, but soon after a beginning program was started for Greek through the same adult education course, and I began to study with a very small group with a lecturer from the Committee of Social Thought there, And that led into a 3-year period of learning Attic Greek, and eventually really being tutored one-on-one by this lecturer, because everyone else dropped out. And so they could no longer run the course because no one's paying for it. But to the latter part of Sarah's introduction, I mean, what has brought me is an enormous amount of discipline and confidence. But I was thinking today was my day to go through my backlog of book reviews and TLS and NYRB. It's brought me a tremendous sense of grounding of Western civilization and context, and I have to have that in the job that I do. We are a humanities-based publisher, and whether I'm publishing poetry today, or contemporary fiction, or an academic work on literary criticism, you'd be surprised at how that basic context informs everything. I read no fewer than 5 book reviews today that I was conversant with because I had this background. I read a book review about John Ruskin, and I only read that because I'm looking at a book on John Ruskin. And right in the middle of it is a little aside about Henry Liddell, the lexicographer of Greek, which of course I knew who it was. So little things like that pop up constantly, and it just gives you an intellectual grounding that is really necessary when you're kind of helping to define and wanting to help to define culture, as is a large part of what we do. So that's how it informs me today, among other things, but I've talked too long. Go ahead.
No, great.
So I guess it's a similar track, albeit a little shorter. The interest in classics started when I was in elementary school. My mother was a curator for the Dallas Museum of Art for 17 years. So I had the privilege of being exposed to a lot of different cultures, artifacts, stories through this, through her work. And so I found myself gravitating towards the more ancient. I was not a modern art type person at all, like that. I just shut off. But the ancient history I was really into. And I think it was, there was one exhibition on ancient Egypt that was happening, and my parents hosted a visiting scholar in Egyptology, and we had dinner at the house, and I was able to interact with this person, and it was a lot of fun, actually, and I could ask all of the harebrained questions that little kids ask, embarrass my parents sufficiently. And then I was able to then go to the exhibit after the dinner as well. And that was actually the first time I think that I saw myself in art. Before it was very much very Western focused, or even African art I couldn't really see myself in so much. But the Egyptian, there was something about seeing the Egyptian iconography that I could really relate to. And so that's, I think, where that the initial flame started there. Fast forward, I guess, and I started college. I went straight into art history because I was very comfortable with that. Loved it, found it very restrictive in a lot of ways. They made me study modern art, and I hated them for it. So I decided to switch majors. As Sarah mentioned, I got my BA in anthropology, which I found to be the most flexible. And because it's all about anthropology, right? And so that was the basis, and then I was able to study then art history and classics together. And so I was able to get, my ancient history kind of fixed there, and then also situate that in much larger, deeper history even than classical history that just kind of fed my soul. The other part of it is that I was very interested in, I guess I should say I had troubles in school with long-form text, especially about classics and especially about archaeology, anthropological practices. I didn't quite get it. So I started drawing stuff out. And then that then somehow extended to 3D modeling. And so I was actually building these spaces that I was reading about so that I could understand them. And so I realized then that there was this this learning difficulty for me that I figured, well, I'm probably not the only person, right, that has this kind of visual learning as their preference. And so that's kind of how I shifted from my path of being an Egyptologist, which is still like something I would love to do, to something where it's like, no, I'm going to provide a way for people to learn about these things that are not these text-minded or have some kind of print disability. And so that's when I started thinking about how do you expand that, how do you expand classics and ancient history to folks like that. And so I started thinking about literacy and differentiated learning, and libraries cropped up, right? It's a place where all of that kind of stuff happens. And so I made that shift there, and that's kind of how I continue to work. And I thought that my classics and ancient history kind of focus would kind of fall by the wayside as I moved into this whole literacy thing, but it hasn't at all, actually. And there does seem to be quite a bit of need for folks who have an understanding of these larger systems, social systems, and how that's, well, I mean, it helps with the classics degree. We see it play over and over and over again. And so that kind of expertise is actually quite useful even within libraries, because we're structuring information and how that feeds into knowledge creation and art. And so it just, there's kind of this nexus that's being defined within the libraries that I think the classicist background really helps with. And then also because it's maybe non-traditional in some sense, you get called on for really fun projects, and you don't have to just shelve books all the time. So, which actually I never do. There's a lot of librarians who don't do that, but so you get called on to do really fun things. And so one of the things that's more recent is the focus on historical reconstruction and its use in video games. So, I mean, how awesome is that, right? So not only do I get to like talk about classics all the time in some circles, but I also get to marry that with video games. I don't know. So it's like an extension that I never thought would happen, but it did, and it's been really quite fun.
Thanks.
So I also started classics through a Great Books program. I did graduate from Yale University, but I actually transferred into Yale, and I started at a small public university, the University of Southern Maine, and I did an honors program there. So essentially at age 19, I was sitting around, this kind of oak table with a bunch of other 19-year-olds, and we're all talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Bacchae and Agamemnon, which remains my favorite play to this day, and because it has a number of compelling characters, particularly Clytemnestra and Cassandra, who I will always remember. But yeah, so we talked about a number of things in addition to these kinds of great books in that program, and one of them that I think has kind of stayed with me and has informed my work is Rhetoric and Logic. Incredibly important it provided an incredibly useful foundation for me. And I'm about to tie this back into Twitter, and you're probably going to think I'm crazy, but I'm going to do it. So what I do now, actually, in addition to collecting books from various parts of the world, is I teach information literacy, and I teach a class called Being Responsible Online, or BRO for short. And in this class, I teach students how to be responsible online, which includes a number of different things like net neutrality, teaching them about net neutrality, etc., evaluating online information. I teach them about how to identify things like fake news. I teach them about lateral reading, how to verify sources, etc. But one thing that I've introduced into this course is a section called Logical Fallacies in Social Media. Yeah, so essentially I talk about post hoc ergo propter hoc. I talk about ad hominem. I bring in examples of these logical fallacies from their natural habitat, Twitter. I have students try to identify them, and then I have the students bring in their own examples of logical fallacies. And it's been absolutely wonderful. And I think the students, they really get it. And because to a certain extent, I think for those of us who were born in kind of the middle or the latter half of the 20th century, I think we're kind of used to our news being filtered to us through broadcast media, right? So we're used to our news being presented to us after it has gone through a great amount of rigor, right?
Digestion.
Exactly. You know, broadcast media has systems of best practices for editors and fact checkers, etc. But in social media, we have none of that. And so in certain ways, I think our media and our information landscape resembles that of the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, maybe even more than that of the 20th century. And it requires a great amount of rigor on the part of the information consumer. And that's something that Aristotle and Socrates and Plato would have a lot to say to us.
Great, thank you.
So I found classics when I was in high school. I grew up in northern North Dakota, and there weren't as many intellectual opportunities as I would have liked. But there was a very unusual woman who would show up at our high school at the end of the day, and she would use a classroom that was no longer being used. The school district wouldn't let her do this during the regular day. And we could take Latin and Greek from her. Her name was Frances Mary McMullen, and she ran a Latin correspondence school. She had stationery printed, and she had hundreds of students across the country that would do, basically it was like an online course before online courses were developed. So she was a character, and I was desperate to be different than everyone in my high school. So I went to this class every day after school religiously. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday we did Latin, and she would call us by our Roman names. So she loved Cornelia, and she would call us, she called us by our first two names. So I was Cornelia Chesley, and I had to rise when she called on me. It was very, very formal, and I loved every minute of it. And on Thursday and Friday, she said we had to do Greek because you can't study Latin without also knowing Greek. So when I got to college, even though I was definitely science-minded and heading into science, I took classics my entire way through college. So I took Latin my first year, and I started Greek my sophomore year. I took Latin and Greek my sophomore year, and then I took Greek all the way through. I never had a minor or major or anything, but I just sort of did this on the side. And what was really great was that it completely informed the way that I thought about my science career. So I study astronomy, I'm an astronomer, as Sarah pointed out, and for me there's this deep connection between the disciplines. If you think about, the ancient Greeks, and especially the pre-Socratic philosophers, essentially with their fragments, they were so ahead of their time. And so when I discovered those fragments and took ancient philosophy classes alongside, the search for life in the universe and thinking about the discovery of planets orbiting around other stars, which they predicted in those fragments, I mean, I just, I felt like my entire college career was complete. The problem was I didn't take a lot of social science, so I've got some catching up to do in that area. But I do really think, for me, going back to the context, I feel like my studies in classics alongside science were just so helpful, and I felt like the studies in classics really provided me with the context I needed to get out of this very detailed work I was doing in physics and astronomy. And so I so appreciated all the courses I took. I had amazing professors. We would sit at small oaken tables, and these were two of the texts that we translated in my sophomore and junior years, and I still keep them as treasured items on my shelf. I look at my notes. It did help also that when I was studying physics, I had no problem identifying all the Greek letters in equations. So I was always sort of. The other thing I did was I was at Wellesley College for my first 2 years in college, and there was a long tradition there of classics. Some amazing faculty members that we got to be in their presence and read texts with them. But by far the favorite thing the years I was there was the annual classics performance. So in traditional times it would have been in an amphitheater outside, which they had. But the year that I participated in the classics performance, we decided to try to build up a wider audience. So my friend Catherine was the director, and I was the sort of assistant director. And we did Iphigenia et Aulis. And we worked with a team of artists in the art department to make foam replicas of ancient Greek masks. So we worked with this unbelievable artist, Carlos, that's I remember his first name, and we painted masks. We did research on what they would have looked like. We all learned 500 to 1,000 lines of ancient Greek memorized. So I was King Agamemnon, and I have a picture. I told you I bring props, so I have a picture. These are my my female classmates who came to support me. It's hard to see, but there is my mask. I don't think I even have the picture in color. And here is the T-shirt we made for the play. It said, Euripides, Iphigenia et Aulis, Jewett Auditorium, Wellesley College, May 1st, 1993, admission free, open to the public. And on the back of the T-shirt it said, my dad went to Troy and all I got was this bloody T-shirt. So we had a Haitian drumming ensemble that provided the music. We did backdrops of modern art, images of war. And the chorus was sung in English, which would help widen the audience's understanding. And then the 5 or 6 of us characters spoke in ancient Greek. So like when I think about... Did
that expand your audience?
It did. We had, it was like on record, it was the biggest performance. And there is a video, there's a VHS of this somewhere that I want to get my hands on. But it was those experiences for me that really shaped my whole undergraduate education. And I think about the work that I do here at the University of Iowa and the way that I think about students and the way that I think about teaching, it all comes back to context. So I teach a lot of introductory astronomy courses, and I'm always giving the stories of discovery, the stories of natural philosophers. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've worked to develop a set of courses on campus called Big Ideas courses. So I've developed 2, and there are 5 other teams of faculty who have developed 5 other courses. And these are courses that are taught at the general education level, and they aim to bring disciplines together. So the requirement is that you teach with at least 2-3 faculty members total that represent different disciplines, and you have this dialogue in front of the students and with the students about how the different disciplines inform each other. And so I can trace back my interest in doing that to my sort of dual life as an undergraduate, doing intense work in classics and then intense work in science. So.
I'll jump in. So you answered some of the basic questions here, so thank you for that. Something that I noticed when all of you were talking was sort of an intellectual self-confidence. And I was wondering if you could speak to how that developed and how that perhaps developed through your studies in classics, or if there's another sort of skill set or mindset that you feel like you developed specifically from your studies of classics. Could you speak to that?
I can say something just because I have, when I actually open these pages and see, I see my notes, I see what I wrote. you know, for me, being at a small college and having small classes where we sat basically at a table with other students and then a faculty member and working through the translation of each of these sentences. For me, I saw no difference between the translation work I did and the equations I was doing in physics, except for the fact that the translation required a higher level of art and articulation and word choice, but we were just trying to understand what the basic translation was. So I do think that experience of, you know, thinking about what you were reading, translating it, communicating it with the professor, hearing, again, the context of why and how that was written, just practicing that over and over again through all those courses was something very complementary to what I was doing in my physics classes.
Yeah, I would echo that to some degree, that within me, as I said, I really felt acutely, and I cannot stress this enough, and I don't want anyone to think that the university press is in bad hands, but I was a horrible student. I mean, horrible. The fact that I got out of college in 4 years is still a mystery to me. I really didn't have much motivation or drive, and I did, as I grew up, which actually happens for me in my 20s, not in my teens, I realized I had really squandered an opportunity. I had been given a real advantage in life and had squandered it, and that was a deep motivation. But as I said, I had developed this kind of inferiority complex and this stagnation, but more than anything, I had become afraid to think. I mean, that might sound silly, but I had really become afraid to engage myself because of probably the concept of failure. I mean, I was not so smart that I never learned how to study, which is why I barely skated through. And I was not so smart like I was a genius and I was getting straight A's barely studying. I was so smart that I was getting like C's and D's. So I needed to learn how to study, but through that, the twin engines of learning a language, an ancient language, of having to learn by rote and then having to learn how to translate, develops a neuroplasticity that was very clear to me when I engaged in it in my 30s. Maybe not when I was in my teens, if that had been the road I had taken, but it was very distinct to me in my early 30s that my mind was changing. You know, much like they talk about mindfulness changes people's neural pathways. I felt that through classics. I could do the stuff by rote. I have a really good memory, and I needed to develop that. But I work with translators in my job, and I have an extraordinarily developed respect for what a translator does, because what is required in that is this deep well of knowledge married with creativity that I'm in awe of. And but in terms of intellectual confidence, that has come to me late in life. I've always been a really, quote unquote, well-read person, as you might expect from my profession. But it seemed like secondhand to me. That's just what I did. I read everything. That was like a hobby. But I did learn that I could engage with ideas and accomplish something that I set out to do that I didn't really think I could do. As I said, I had always failed at trying to learn a language. And so as kind of intellectual penance, I decided to pick the hardest thing I could find, other than like Sanskrit, and learn it. And that did bring a lot of confidence to me, I think.
That's funny. You should say you weren't very good at language. I was actually really horrible at languages too.
Yeah.
That was one of the first stumbling blocks, I guess, of my path to Egyptology, was the fact that I had to learn like a bajillion languages just to get to the professional level. There's a lot to be said about taking, you know, different languages and growing through that. And I think that does provide a level of understanding, at least on the cultural level, that I think just studying cultural, I was going to say cultural anthropology, cultural studies doesn't necessarily provide. of context there that I think we're missing unless we do take language. But yeah, in terms of like confidence, intellectual confidence, that's something I think that we kind of work on iteratively. At least I do. There's a point at which you peak and you're like, yeah, I got this, and then you meet someone else and you're like, ooh, I do not have this at all. You know? But being able to deal with those ups and downs, I think I think you just kind of figure the mechanism is for that. I thought I knew everything about ancient history from a museum, and come to find out that I did not, because they had to distill that into a placard that only allowed a paragraph. So there's not a lot you can necessarily take out of that. And so yeah, once I got to college, it was kind of eye-opening. I was also not a very good studier. But I think some of the confidence in continuing to pursue that actually came from a lot of the folks that I did meet. And a lot of the professors that were supporting me through that. There's a couple in here actually who were really helpful as I was trying to get through college. And so I mean that kind of confidence, though it's self-propelling and motivating, there's also you have friends that can help you with that. At least I found that there are times when I lean on them, right? And so I think that's that flexibility to ask for help, ask for guidance, just have someone be like, "Am I doing this right? No, you're great." It's like that's what I needed, and that's the level of self-awareness kind of helps develop that as well, I think.
So I mean, the word confidence, I think for me is kind of a funny word because I feel like as I get older, I become in some ways less and less confident about most things. But I think Socrates would be very happy with that because I think what I learned because what I think I learned from these classical texts and probably the most valuable lesson was to doubt, was to question absolutely everything. And it's funny because like I just said, I'm maybe in some ways not as confident, but in some ways I actually think I am more confident because I'm able to look at a comment someone makes in the comment section and say, okay, well, yeah, I don't have to accept that, right?
That's healthy.
Yeah.
That's very healthy.
And I can look at it and say, oh yes, that's a straw man, or oh yes, that's a false dichotomy.
Yeah. I wanted to ask one question before
Sure.
then we'll move to the crowd for the last 15 minutes or so. But Hannah said something earlier about seeing herself in Egyptology, right? And I just wondered whether you to see yourself in a different form at a different time period, and whether that had something to do with your love of classics. Like, what happens when you do or do not see yourself in a discipline, whatever your identity or ethnicity or gender, how does that shape whether you connected to classics or not?
Yeah, that's going back to the kind of intellectual intimidation thing. For me, that's a real thorny, knotty issue. I would never label myself as anything other than a dilettante and perhaps a flaneur. I don't think I belong in anything, which is probably why I'm a pretty decent publisher. It demands that I have to be a jack of all trades, both in understanding content, but also in a lot of other ways. And because of that understanding of myself, I think it's actually allowed me to excel at that. I do see a lot of publishers who are who do identify in a very close way with a discipline or something else, and it's often to their detriment. They get too narrow-minded and focused, and have, in my mind at least, in my interpretation, have trouble seeing larger issues. So that would be my answer. But
it's really helpful when you work at a university to be, you know, so open to other disciplines. It makes being on campus so rewarding. You know, I'm always so interested in what my colleagues are doing in different departments. I want to know about courses and opportunities for students when they come and talk to me. You know, I do a lot of advising, and I love to help, especially like the physics and astronomy students, find courses outside of our department. They spend so much time in our department, and so I think, you know, my background in being able to, you know, sort of be both in science and have one foot in the humanities or the classics or whatever you call it has just, I think, really helped me be a better member of a university community, and I really appreciate that. I think about it almost on a daily basis. Something will come up in my work life where I need to, you know, find out what's going on in a different department, and it allows me to quickly parse course titles and try to put in, you know, in my head in different areas. And I think it's that broad context that I got studying classics.
I think, let me be a little bit more specific about how personal, and this might be too personal, but let me just give you an example. I come from a lower middle class background. When I started reading about blue collar worker, artisans, and tradesmen, which is what I write about, I saw myself there. I saw people who didn't have a lot of money, who had like maybe strong family ties, but I come from the Appalachian Mountains. I'm a Southerner in classics, which doesn't happen all that much, right? Myself, particularly with the kind of hoi polloi artisans and tradesmen that I went on to study. And so that's what I kind of grasped onto. So when you read Sappho, when you read Women, did you feel like you saw yourself as a woman as well? Like that you saw that there were women in the ancient world that you could connect to? No?
No, I was right. I just wanted to be one of the guys. I wanted to be one of the guys writing a fragment about the chance to find worlds other than our own. Yeah. So I didn't have that personal connection, but I had a connection to the material. I think because I was learning, I was reading a lot of astronomy, and I was really fascinated with this idea that, you know, the early philosophers were also just, again, they were multidisciplinarians, you know, naturally, and I really loved that. So that's how I saw myself, as I wanted to be that kind of traditional scholar, or just, you know, generalist, somebody who knew a lot about many things.
You know, in general, I do connect with the idea of tragedy. I mean, and I'm an optimist. You know, and we all have to deal with tragedy in our life on a pretty severe level. That's what life is, if you choose to look at it that way. And I think that universality of, both in the very nuanced ways that the Greeks dealt with it, really appealed to me. As I said, coming to it later and being at that table that we've all been at, but being with people who had a lifetime of experience of losing children, doctors who had, you know, gone through a lifetime of losing patients, lawyers who had seen the worst come out of family law, and everything else was really eye-opening. And today, I mean, the PTSD that comes out of Achilles. I mean, all those things do greatly inform me. And as with any kind of group therapy, I mean, it's letting you know it's all right. You know, that's the way the human condition has always been. And so for that, I mean, that's what I relate to. But otherwise,
I don't know if I have so much, this isn't necessarily so much of a personal anecdote, but I think that one thing that we should think about here is that classics is kind of, it's called classics for a reason, because these, right, something is classic if it's something that can resonate with multiple different kinds of people at multiple different times. So we, you know, if we talk about a classical text, like a classic American text, it's something that's timeless in a way. And so I'm not of Middle Eastern background, but you know, I know from studying the Middle East for a number of years that for hundreds of the Islamic Empire saw itself as the inheritor of the classical world. I mean, I think that we tend to think in the United States and in Europe that we are kind of, sort of the natural inheritors of classical texts, but for a very long time, for 400 or 500 years, that wasn't the case.
I guess I could expound a little bit if you want. I think what I really... Actually, you know what? It probably stems all the way to, like, dressing up for Halloween. I know, okay, I'll get there. So my mom and I are also, we're kind of nerds. And for Halloween, my mom and I would figure out what our costumes were. She wouldn't dress up. I say our because I made my little brother do exactly what I wanted him to. And so we were always paired. And so whatever, we dressed up as Halloween, we were always related in some way. So we, every year we would dress up, and we did there was one year I was Queen Elizabeth I, really awesome costume. There was another, I was a pirate too, it was fine. But there was also Martha and George Washington, which went over interestingly. Because I wasn't immediately recognized as being Martha Washington. But when I dressed up as Nefertiti, and when my brother dressed up as Ramses, people got it. And so and we were really young at this point. And so I think that initial first impression of being like, now people know. This must be where people who look like me reside, is in ancient Egypt. And so I was really interested in where those people came from and what they were doing, because they're in museums too, so they must be important. In ways that, medieval portraiture kind of isn't necessarily as rounded out. And so I think it was something as simple as that, as being recognized when you were dressing up in these really nerdy costumes. That kind of, I think, it made that initial reaction. And I think I was wearing the galabeya that Egyptologist gave to me from that dinner. So it was like, yes. So I think that might have been a little bit of that. Growing up in that museum setting, it was quite interesting to see what types of people came. I would say, a rather observant child. And so I would see the types of people and patrons that would come and donors that would come to the museum, and what kind of spaces they would inhibit and build, and the kinds of social structures that were part of that. And so there was a constant reflection of being the only black kid in this area, and what that meant in terms of art and in terms of civilization, and what was important. And so I think that's why I had this initial, really personal connection, is because of those circles I was inhabiting. But I think it might be also very, well, it is individual, right? It's not everyone's experience. So that's what I meant by that.
Great. We don't have a ton of time. We have about 10 more minutes before we go. But I did want to throw it out to the crowd just in case you guys have questions. And you can direct it towards the entirety of the panel or towards individuals if you really want to. So, it's up to you. Yeah, Dana?
So you guys are speaking before of new, middle, and old students of classics, or people who are just enthusiastic about the classical studies in general, which is wonderful. And it's nice to hear that several of you didn't start out or intend to do classics, but you kind of found your way there in your lifelong studies. In a day and age where the humanities are under attack and people are constantly having to justify the study of classics specifically, I'm just wondering if any of you had to justify your hobby or your coursework or your interests to loved ones or relatives of loved ones or your friends, and maybe advice to young students in the audience who are dealing with that now with your own parents. How did you deal with it if you had to experience with it? Is there advice you can give to them?
Well, I started as an English major. perhaps one of the reasons I was not a good student was I was the original latchkey kid from the 70s and 80s and all that implied, which was not a lot of parenting. And I remember the only, life advice I got educationally was just go and get a degree. We don't care what it's in. Just get the degree. So I didn't have to fight that battle with my parents that, you need to go and find a vocation and all that other stuff. But I'm a parent now, and a 13-year-old who is developing his own interest and taste and personality constantly, who is intellectually very bright, who tells me this morning that he's getting 3 Bs at the junior high level, and I'm thinking, silently, Jesus, I was a horrible student. Even I made straight A's in junior high. Come on, kid. I believe part of this is kind of a metaphysical Greek answer. I believe in the life of the mind, and I believe that we can't know that by following what we want, what we love, and what we want to know, how that can possibly prepare us for our future. I could never dream. I didn't know it was a job. But when I was 17 or 18, I could never dream that I would have been a press director. Nor could I have dreamed it when I was working for a university press when I was 30. It wasn't something that was going to be available in my career path. And my career really accelerated when, I began to question and doubt everything. I no longer became satisfied with, we do it this way because we've always done it this way. That's such a lazy way to think about life. And it's also a way to ruffle a lot of feathers to a bad end. But my point is, pursue what you love. You're not living this life for other people. I do believe that your quality, your intellect, whatever, in the words of Schaeffer, will out. It will surface to the top of what you will find a passion, whether it is to become a classics professor or some other pursuit that, if you really want it, will marry what you've learned with whatever profession you pursue, and it will be a benefit to you. So take this time, whatever has led you here right now, to pursue it. And don't worry so much about what other people think.
There's quite a, just to add to that, because I advise a lot of students, and I gave the commencement address last year at the University of Iowa. The big commencement is pretty overwhelming. I was so glad I had everything written out like an ancient, the speaker might in the structure. But I had done quite a bit of research in preparing for the address, and one of the things I looked at is what employers of recent college graduates in this day and age, when employees now going forward are probably going to change their careers. So all the students in the audience who are graduating, I was telling them, you are probably going to be of a generation that changes your career 7 to 8 times. That's not the generation that I've been in. And so the skills that are required as in undergraduate studies, and I'm sure there are logical connections with graduate studies, and we do this in student studies theoretical physics. I spend a lot of time talking to their parents about what they can hope to do, and what I say is, it's the habits of mind, it's the discipline, it's the critical thinking, and all of these things we're practicing in our courses. And if you love what you study and you make, you're very successful at it, you really can do everything. It's anything. It's very hard to convince people of that, but you see it over and over again. People who become editors of newspapers, they don't necessarily have degrees in journalism. They may acquire the skills of the field of journalism at some point, but what they're very good writers, they're very broad thinkers, they really have dug into particular things that they enjoy studying about. So that's a message we try to convey to parents, is that,
you can't replace passion. I mean, not just for one thing, but it bleeds over into everything. And discipline is so important. I've strived for discipline all my life. And I will never achieve the ideal that I want to achieve on that end. But particularly classics, I think, brings that out. But any kind of rigorous, it is a training of your mind that will pay off. And so many people, if they don't do that, they struggle when they get into whatever workforce it is.
And STEM employers more and more actually don't want students or don't end up hiring after they interview hundreds of students or hundreds of graduates. The ones they end up hiring often have the kind of what an employer might call soft skills, or being able to think through something logically, to be able to work with a team, to go back to that table where you're sitting with the text and translating. Those are actually the kinds of things that can make very, very successful employees. And so more and more, even STEM employers are saying they actually really hope their students have taken a wide variety of courses in their undergraduate training.
So one of my favorite classical texts is actually Nicomachean Ethics, because it teaches us this, right? I mean, it's also the best parenting guide I know. It really is. It is about there's a right way and there's a wrong way, and there's habituation and all those things that you can't say enough about. But yeah, live your dream if that's what you want to do.
Hannah, Tim, did you want to say anything for?
I feel comfortable with that.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, from my perspective, we need more people who understand how to teach things like rhetoric and logic to students. We absolutely need more people who can do that. And I feel like the reasons are probably abundantly apparent to all of you.
Say no more.
Yeah. Some of my students really, really struggle when they try to apply things like logical reasoning to their day-to-day information-seeking behavior.
Yes.
So
I see that with employees, really intelligent people, but
yep.
Logically they're lacking, and it shows up in organization, and it shows up in information seeking and that kind of stuff, which we do a lot of, and it's at a deficit right now. So I would agree with that.
Great. Well, Jen, did you have anything else that you wanted to say?
Can I throw a quick question?
Please.
I think some of you have
Yep.
already answered it, but favorite text or author, and then I hesitate to say least favorite, maybe the one that makes you pull your hair out, and I could be the same as your favorite, but.
Okay. So favorite and least favorite.
All right, favorite, Agamemnon, as I said. Least favorite is the Odyssey. And that is because it is so overdone. This narrative of one man against the world, like, please.
My favorite is Prometheus Bound, just because I translated the whole thing and I'm proud of myself for doing it. Least favorite, I struggled actually a lot with the Aeneid when I first translated that, and I never quite got it that he was actually telling a story, that the things weren't happening in real time, and I'll never forget getting my first graded work back in college where my classics professor said, I think there's some really big gaps in your understanding of this. So I've always felt a little worried about that book.
Actually, Going Forth by Day. So it's like the Book of the Dead, ancient Egypt. It's so much fun. Least favorite, I guess it would be the Odyssey, just because I had to read it, and I don't like people telling me what I should like. And that was one of those. Like, it is the text you should read. It's amazing, and I was bored through the whole thing.
I'll stick with Nicomachean Ethics just as a practical guide. Boy, I remember really not enjoying some of Plato's dialogues, particularly the Meno. As I give a big thumbs up to logical thinking, somehow that was lost on me. So I'll go with that. You know, the Odyssey is interesting. I'm sure you guys know the background on that, but until about 50 years ago, it was not a primary text that one had to read. It was actually kind of a lesser text because of these reasons. And since, I think it's been elevated to the level of the Iliad. But my understanding is, until the 20th century, it was not looked upon as a great work. So.
Well, great, wonderful. Well, I wanted to thank our panelists for coming and talking to us a little bit about classics, and thank my co-moderators and Teitle. This has been really wonderful. So I would encourage you, before I send you forth, I'm surprised no one said the Bible as their favorite and least favorite. They usually even have it that same space for me. It's like one of my favorites and one of my least favorites at the same time, and that's because, as you guys point out, canonical texts can be, something that you are forced to read, and so maybe we don't always respond to it. But I would say, keep in touch. Many of you are here because you love classics. Some of you are here because you love extra credit. That's also okay. All of these things are okay. So keep in touch and make sure to reach out to myself or some of our panelists if you have any more questions. So thank you guys very much. Yeah. Thank you.